My research interest is sensory food science, so what food tastes like, what it feels like, what it smells like, what it looks like. And then I'm also on the side of the food scientist that's responsible for doing the product development in industry. Down. Right, so the content of the next few minutes that I would like to share with you is briefly just remind you why we are concerned about sodium reduction. And obviously you are the experts in this area, and I'm not going to spend too much time on the physiological or clinical issues. I would like to take you through the mandatory regulation to reduce sodium content of foodstuffs, and then spend some time to give you a bit of appreciation of the role and the function of salt in particular, and then other sodium-containing compounds that are used by food technologists and food scientists when we develop food products. Of particular concern or interest is the magic of the salty taste that salt in particular and some of the other sodium-containing compounds can impart in food. And not only taste, but flavor, and I would like to discuss the difference between the two, and then some challenges ahead. So we all know that the current salt and sodium intake in the South African diet, similar to the rest of the world, is way above what it should be from a health perspective. So the estimates are that we consume about 10 grams of salt on average per day. Depending on the research that you read, this may be 9 grams or 10 grams. But on a whole, way too much. The recommended WHO level is that this should be reduced to an average of 5 grams of salt per day. And this equates to about 2 grams or 2,000 milligrams of sodium per day. And in my view, that is one of the most difficult aspects for you as dietitians or nutritionists to convey to the public. And for me as a food scientist even, it's difficult to understand the concept of what is too much when it gets to salt. Because if we think about it, 5 grams of salt, if we look at it, what it looks like on the table, looks pretty a small quantity. And when we add a pinch of salt to our porridge in the morning and a pinch of salt to the stew and a teaspoon of salt to the stew at night, it quickly adds up. But it's very difficult to understand this concept of 2 grams and how do you convey it to a patient or to a consumer. At the moment, the latest issue of the National Geographic magazine has a feature on sugar in the diet and why we crave sugar. And they use the typical shocked statistic where they show the mountain of sugar that you can find in a can of soda or a soft drink. And that is graphic, and we can see it, and it shocks us. But when it gets to salt, it's more difficult to convey. I mean, most of us grew up with a table where the salt shaker is almost as part of the table as a tablecloth. So how much is too much? And how do you actually practically reduce sodium intake? I've read that the physiological requirement for sodium is about 200 to 500 milligrams per day. And a lot of the mystery around our preference for salt consumption and our intake for intake of salt is about the issue, why do we crave more than what is really necessary? The health issue, so high salt or sodium intake leads to hypertension and stroke, And there's a definite relationship with cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease. But that's your field of the spectrum. In terms of the sources of sodium contribution, differences depending on the study that you read, but discretionary salt consumption, so intake added at the table or during cooking, only contributes about 15 to 20% of our intake of sodium and salt. And the main culprits apparently are the salt that's contained in processed foods and in restaurant foods, so that's about 75%. And then sodium that occurs naturally in food, it's estimated that that contributes about 10% of the intake. And for this reason, many authorities around the world is targeting the salt environment. So the salt that is hidden and that is contained in the food that we buy or the food that we use out of the home. So the regulation that was signed, or the notice of the regulation that was signed in March of this year, really tasks food manufacturers to reduce sodium content in certain foods. And we know that a gradual reduction in salt content in foods is probably going to work better, and therefore there's initial reductions that will become that will be implemented then in 2016, and further reductions in 2018. So it's a process that will run over a couple of years. And the problem with salt reduction and the effectiveness of this program is that it's long-term. It will take a few years before we really see whether there's a beneficial effect. And we also take time to adapt to lower salt content in food and to prefer that. I can take some examples. If you think of margarine, so many years back there was one type of margarine on the market, one fat content. Nowadays we get medium fat, we get low fat, and we cannot necessarily really distinguish the taste properties of the different products. And some of us have adapted to using a lower fat content margarine. The same for milk. I think when I grew up it was full cream milk, and now we have 2% and even 1%. And if you adapt to the new fat content, when you go back to full fat milk, you can immediately taste the difference. So it takes some time for our sensory system to also adapt to new taste profiles. Maybe a bit small from the back, and I'm going to read it. So which foods are targeted by the regulation? It's believed that bread intake contributes the most sodium in the diet. So there's the regulation targets bread, and there's numbers there for the reduction in 2016, or the levels of total sodium per 100 grams of foodstuff that bread will have to comply with by 2016 and then by 2018. Breakfast cereals and porridges, and these products are often you don't taste the salt. Even bread, you don't necessarily taste the salt, but when it's not there, it makes a difference. Fat spreads and butter spreads. The ones that seem obvious, and this is probably where we can taste salt, and you can understand why it contributes to salt intake, is ready-to-eat savory snacks, things like salted peanuts, potato chips, all the knacks and the puffs, but they exclude salt and vinegar flavored versions. Flavored potato chips as a separate category then, flavored ready-to-eat savory snacks and potato chips of the salt and vinegar flavor variety, so higher levels of sodium are allowed in products that are sold as salt and vinegar chips. Then the category of processed meats, so hams, and there's an uncured category, and this is typically sausages, raw sausages, cooked sausages, and then processed meat that's cured. So the cured processed meat may have higher levels of sodium in the product. Raw processed meats, sausages. Okay, doesn't matter. I don't have a pointer, but that as a separate category. Dry soup powders, not the instant type, and then dry gravy powders and dry instant savory sauces, and the contribution from these flavorants that are often used by consumers in cooking. Dry savory powders with dry instant noodles to be mixed with a liquid. Now, many of your customers or patients will probably talk about children in particular that crave these instant noodles and have them for lunch. In my home, that happens quite often. And then also lastly, stock cubes, which may be in the form of powders, granules, emulsions, pastes, or jellies. Specifically targeted, because it's believed that a large part of the population use a lot of these stock cubes in flavoring stews. Now, when we look at the values there, it really doesn't mean much unless we can relate it to what are the levels at the present time in these products. So I just took a few examples. So for bacon, a report by WHO on sodium content of bacon talks about 1,500 milligrams of sodium per 100 gram, and that is taken from food composition database tables from around the world. Hugo, who is a meat scientist from University of Free State, presented data a while ago that bacon in South Africa, the sodium content ranges from 632 to 1,028 milligrams sodium. And I checked the label of smoked streaky bacon from one of our upmarket retailers, and I saw 788 milligrams sodium per 100 grams of bacon. So there's a huge variation. For this the last product, it's already below the regulation. So this company does not need to do much or change the product. But if your product is around 1,500 milligrams, it's almost a quarter or 50% reduction in sodium content. And that can have technological implications and taste implications for your customers. When we look at stock cubes, I just checked some labels. Now this is the reported values on the product. So a stock cube at the moment, 20,700 milligrams. The regulation requires a reduction to 18,000 milligrams per 100 gram. Another product is stock powder, which is way below the regulation and even complies with the regulation for 2018. I can just say that this stock powder is a higher end product. It costs more, and so we must keep that in mind as well. For ready-to-eat savory snacks, I checked the label of popular knickknacks, and it is close to the recommended or the mandatory regulation standard then for 2016, but it will have to be reduced even way more for 2018. Soup powder, way above the regulation for 2016, and you can see almost a 50% reduction required by 2018. So this perhaps puts it more into perspective. Some companies definitely have started working on this 2-3 years ago. What is also complicating the matter is anyone can start a food business in South Africa. So the larger players, it's probably part of their product development program at the moment. The person supplying the taste navorate or the home industry may not even be aware that such a regulation is on the cards. So, yes, we are concerned with the policing, the monitoring of the regulation, obviously, and that we will see how that will be handled. It's also known that any salt sodium reduction program will be more effective if there's education programs or awareness programs. So the Department of Health promised that there will be a national education campaign on salt reduction, started in a lobby group, the Salt Watch group, where they work in association with the World Action on Salt and Health group, which is an international group. And I think salt reduction is really the flavor of the month. So a lot of research is done at the moment. A lot of information is available on the internet, and companies and nutritionists, dietitians should take note of that and not reinvent the wheel necessarily. We must also be aware that even though sodium chloride is the main contributor to sodium in the diet, there are many other ingredients that also contribute sodium in the diet. If we think of sodium bicarbonate, that is used in most bakery products. But a lot of sodium-containing additives that have specific functions in food products that may contribute sodium in that particular food stuff. So sodium chloride, the contribution about 40% of sodium in that compound. If we think of sodium lactate, which is used as an acidulant and has an influence on preservation and shelf life of products. Sodium nitrite, the sodium part is about 33%, but note we typically use sodium nitrite in very, very small quantities. So the contribution is not that much. But when we are developing food products, do not only consider the sodium chloride, the salt on the label, but also some of the other additives. I want to move on to the functions of salt or sodium-containing compounds in food products, and I'm going to mainly refer to salt, sodium chloride. We know that it has a preservation action, it contributes taste and flavor, and in most of the targeted products, the first role is probably taste and flavor. It also affects texture of many products. It can affect the color and appearance. It's used because it can improve the yield. If you think of the brining of chickens, which is a controversial aspect of the moment, or a controversial issue at the moment, it's the salt that gives you the ability to brine the chicken and to keep water in the chicken. Salt is a cheap ingredient, and it's definitely, to replace it may be an economic issue. The original purpose of adding food or salt to food was preservation. So salt have a definite function in controlling the growth of pathogenic, but also spoilage organisms. And in that way, the food safety issue is something that we definitely have to take care of when we start reducing salt in food products. When we reduce salt in food products, we may affect the shelf life, and it's normally affected negatively. So in food science, we use the concept of hurdle technology when we design the preservation system of a food product. And we essentially try to use different preservation actions or systems in low amounts or in lower concentrations so that we do not rely on only one preservation hurdle to give us shelf life or safety. So typically, salt reduces water activity. We would combine that with lowering or adjusting pH, temperature, so whether you cook a product partially or at a certain temperature, availability of oxygen, pressure. Even addition of fat can lower water activity. So in combination with salt, you change the shelf life. And then many other additives, sodium benzoate to preserve, sodium lactate, sodium nitrite, sodium nitrate. And all these additives are often added, well, in most cases, they are added with a specific function in mind. You should never add an additive if it does not have a function, obviously. It just contributes to cost. Just to demonstrate how the addition of sodium chloride can have an effect on the growth of foodborne pathogens. So, for example, if we take Listeria monocytogenes, the diamond, the line with the diamond, and Listeria monocytogenes is a pathogen of particular importance in the food industry because it can survive refrigerated temperatures. So if we reduce the salt content from 4.5% to 2.5%, it has an effect on the generation time of this pathogen. So it may affect the safety of the food. So it's always a bigger picture. It's not just you reduce the salt content to give the product a certain flavor, but you have to check the safety and shelf life as well. On spoilage bacteria, so again we've got salt content or salt concentration on the x-axis, generation time for these organisms on the y-axis, Pseudomonas, which is a typical spoilage organism in many food products. When we reduce salt concentration, we reduce the generation time, and you will then have faster spoilage of a product. So this is a model system, but we have to keep that in mind. So just to hopefully convince you that it's not a simple matter for food product developers. Just to understand and I call it the magic of salt taste and its effect on food flavor. So salt is one of the basic taste properties, and we have 5 taste properties: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami, which is a savory taste. And we know that sodium chloride is perceived as the saltiest sodium compound. And just to give you some view of how do we perceive salt, in our sensory system we have a very specific epithelial sodium channel that only allows sodium to pass from the oral cavity on this side to the salt taste receptor cell. And it's very specific for sodium. It only allows sodium and lithium. Lithium, which is a toxic compound and that we would not have in foods. So it's very specific for sodium. And this is the reason why sodium chloride or sodium in particular, contributes best to salty taste. We also know that you can taste potassium chloride, also gives a salty taste, but it cannot pass this epithelium sodium channel. So it's believed that there's a second taste receptor system for other compounds. It's also known that as the size of the anion associated with sodium increases, the perceived saltiness decreases. So it's not so easy to replace chloride, sodium chloride, with potassium chloride, because it does not give the same salt flavor, and it also contributes often bitterness to the compound. And then you have to mask the bitterness again. Salt can also enhance the flavor of many other ingredients. So when you add salt to meat, and we are probably all direct witnesses of this, when we cook food, when you add a pinch of salt, you change the flavor. And you do not only change the salty flavor, but you change the flavor of the dish. Meat tastes more meaty, vegetables taste more vegetable-y. And you can enhance, for example, herb flavors. Monosodium glutamate, which is fairly tasteless when you taste it on its own. When you add it to meat, it enhances meat flavor in particular. Salt taste also has an effect on other tastes. For example, it can enhance sweet taste, depending on the sweet compound. It can mask bitterness. And this suppression of masking of bitterness is particularly used in the food industry to mask taste that's created by food processing. In general, it adds to a more appealing food flavor. And that's the challenge, for you to convince a patient to reduce salt intake or salt addition at the table, but also then risk eating food that's more bland. I'll explain what you see here. So there's a solid line. This one is a solid line, and this is the sensory profile of pea soup with no salt added. So that's the baseline, and then we add salt, and that's the thick line, outer line with the solid circles. When we add 0.3% salt to this pea soup, it increases our perception of thickness. It increases significantly our perception of fullness of flavor or balance of flavor. Obviously, we increase the perception of saltiness, but we also increase the perception of sweet taste. We mask metallic taste. It has an effect on bitter taste perception. It balances, it gives us a more balanced view. It improves the overall flavor strength, or intensifies the overall flavor strength. So the cross-modal sensory mechanisms we see in when we cook, we see when we do sensory studies. However, the mechanisms and the understanding of why these things happen is not so clearly understood, because we rely on people to tell us what they experience. And it's believed that it may be interaction with salt taste receptors from various modalities, so sweetness or texture, but also salt could activate our touch neural systems. So in the mouth, and this makes it very interesting, but also quite complicated. We have to understand how salt concentration affects perception of salt in a food and preference. So on this schematic at the bottom, salt concentration, and the y-axis, acceptability. So these are hypothetical foods. So let's take food A, which is the pink bars here, the one with a very sharp increase. So as we increase salt concentration, acceptability increases up to a certain level. When we go beyond that, the product becomes too salty and the product is less acceptable. So it's very clear that for this product, you do not want to move away too much from this level of salt concentration, because you will affect acceptability. However, for other products, we've got a more broad optimum. So if we increase the salt concentration for this product, acceptability remains at the same level, independent of the salt concentration. So if we move from 6% salt to 2% salt, we do not change acceptability very much. So we have to understand different foods and how salt concentration affects perception and preference. Maybe more of interest to you, little is known about any relations between the perception of savory tastes, such as salt and glutamate or umami flavor, and body mass. So there's a lot of studies that have looked at the relationship between our sensitivity to sweetness or our preference for sweetness and obesity. And many studies have also looked at the same relationship between bitter perception and body mass. So the theory is that if you are more sensitive to bitter compounds, you avoid certain foods. However, then, little is known about salt taste perception, the genetics, if there's any genetic link between salt taste perception and body mass. And I'm sure that in the next few years there will be a lot of studies focusing on this issue. Food texture and mouthfeel, yes, we've experienced it. It makes products, especially liquids, seem thicker or fuller. And from a very young age, we are taught you should taste the food before you serve it to other people. And a lot of our appreciation as a cook or as a mother serving the family is the ability to serve food that tastes good. And in that way, the cook is often responsible for adding sodium to food products. Just going to talk about meat products for a while and why we add so much salt to meat products. And it's not only for flavor. Yes, flavor definitely, but a very definite functional role. When you are making a product like a Vienna sausage or a bologna, you add salt because it activates the myofibrillar proteins and it allows those proteins to hydrate, therefore bind water, and for the product then to become much more juicy and to actually build that framework of an emulsion. So without salt, you are not able to activate these functional proteins. When you add salt and you mince meat, it forms a sticky mass on the surface of the meat pieces, and when you cook the product, it then binds the meat pieces together. So essential for this functional role. Without salt, you cannot retain moisture, so you can't retain the water in the product, and when you cook it, the product will be extremely dry. The addition of salt allows you to, therefore, to retain the moisture, also to mix effectively with fat, and therefore tenderize the product, give it a good flavor. So essential in meat processing. Also in hams, when you are making a ham, you add salt in order to bind water in the product and give it that very specific texture. In bread baking, salt controls yeast growth and the sourdough starters which we use. So the tolerance of the microorganisms to salt is utilized to develop the dough during bread making. And when we reduce salt levels, we may allow for faster dough development, but the dough is not strong enough to hold the bubbles. So you get a poor texture bread. So we don't just add salt for flavor, definitely for dough development and the properties of the bread. Salt also contributes to the development of the gluten network in yeast breads. And it's not so simple as when you reduce the salt content, the dough development will be different. It also depends on the quality of the bread flour that you are using. How important salt is. The poorer the flour quality, and that's often linked to protein content and protein quality, the more the reliance on salt as a functional ingredient. So if you read studies where they reduce the salt content and they still create good breads, it may be very dependent on the type of flour that is used. Obviously, because of the growth of the microorganisms that synthesize important flavor compounds, the salt may also change the flavor development in the bread if we change the quantities. Salt also contributes to color development in baked products and snacks. Salt seems to have a plasticizing effect during heating of cereal products, which improve mobility of reactants. And for a food scientist, the Maillard reaction is very important because it's the one reaction that produces not only colors, browning reactions, but also flavor. So when we change the salt content, it may have an effect on the color of the bread. And something as simple as that may be seen by a consumer as changing the taste of the product. And they will change their brand. So these things are very important for food manufacturers. Just at the bottom, in the snack industry, when we add flavors and colors to products, we add minute quantities, very small quantities. And these products, the flavors and the colors, are often plated on salt crystals. And then, so the salt and the flavorants are added at the same time. And this allows for even distribution over the surface of the snack. So when we reduce the salt content, it may also affect this even distribution or the effectiveness of covering or coating the product. Salt level also seems to have a role in the degree of expansion and airiness of extruded snack products like puffs or cheese curls, that type of thing. So a food product developer has to take notice of that as well. Finally, salt is cheaper. Salt is cheaper than adding most flavorants. And that's one of the reasons why food manufacturers have to weigh up the cost of products or the cost of substitutes. At this stage, many companies are developing salt substitutes. So we will see a lot of them available, but they will have to compare on price. Obviously, we may say salt is cheap, but compared to what? The whole idea of the salt reduction regulation is to lower the burden on healthcare costs for the population. So it depends on what you compare it with. And a very true saying here, nearly everything tastes better with salt. I said it's a simple concept, although it's very complex. Strategies for lowering sodium reduction. So these are some of the strategies that the industry will look at. Definitely gradual lowering of salt and sodium content. They are considering salt substitutes. We know that we can adjust to lower salt levels if we are willing to start reducing our taste preferences. But it will take longer for certain products, and it will not necessarily work for other products. The use of flavor enhancers and masking agents. So monosodium glutamate, MSG, for example, can reduce some of the function of salt. Changing the physical form of salt. It's believed that if you take a smaller crystal size, the crystal dissolves faster and you perceive salt taste faster. So that may work for certain products. Alternative processing techniques, where salt is not used for flavor purposes, you may consider an alternative processing techniques to get the functional role. Lower sodium and promote or inform. So there's a lot of research about if it's stated on the label that this is a lower sodium product, that it will be more it will be seen as more suitable for some consumers. The opposite is also true. When consumers read on a label, this is now lower in sodium, they compensate and they add more sodium at the table. In my view, a strategy that can be used is to promote a balanced diet, because while the regulation emphasizes sodium, we have to reduce our sodium intake. It's also true that we must increase our potassium and calcium intake. So these components work together. Just to emphasize that the salt route is not as simple as forcing the food industry or the primary ingredient producers to lower sodium content in food products. There's a secondary product manufacturing industry that uses the spreads and the bread and the stock cubes in manufacturing products that are also sold to consumers. And in this area where the regulation does not apply, you may just add more salt. And then obviously what the consumers will do, will they add more salt at the table? And that's something that's very difficult to predict. When the regulations come into play, what is consumers going to do? And we will have to check their behavior. Right, so these interactions, very important. I conclude the challenge for the food industry is to take note of what is known. There's a lot of international research, there's internal research. Whatever you decide and when you change your products, you have to take note of food safety, the effects on food quality. We have to understand what our reductions in sodium content is doing to the sensory perception of the product. It's a challenge because labels will need to be changed. For me, another challenge is the analytical testing of sodium content. The regulation specifies the specific methods that need to be used. Do we have enough qualified or accredited laboratories that can handle this further testing of sodium content? What will the smaller groups do? What will the smaller entrepreneurs, food entrepreneurs do? And then obviously the challenge to try to predict what will be the market response, what will consumers do? Thank you.